Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Selling AI. Today we're digging into something most B2B sales and marketing teams badly underweight: the emotional psychology sitting underneath even the most rational sale out there. My guest is Dr. Chris Gray, founder and CEO of The Psychologist, a consumer psychology consultancy, and one of the rare people in the space who's both a clinical psychologist turned researcher and really just like 30 years battle test inside sales. Here's what makes this interesting. Chris has a simple equation for why people buy. Motivation plus means plus a call to action is really what it takes someone to make a decision in a buying process. In today's episode, Chris and I talk about why psychology stays stable while buyer behavior shifts fast, and how sellers can actually map what their buying committee cares about beyond just the surface level details they're getting in their calls. All right, let's get to it. Chris, thanks so much for being on the show today.
All right, Warren, thank you so much for having me on. It's my pleasure.
Awesome, man. Well, listen, first, give us a little bit of a background. You got a degree in psychology, your doctorate, in fact. You realized you didn't want to be a day-to-day therapist. What was the moment that kind of made you pivot, and how did you end up with what you're doing today?
Yeah, I don't know if there was one moment. It was a series of events and things that happened. And, I was finishing up my doctorate in the late 90s. It was a tough time in healthcare. HMOs were taking over and managed care. And, kind of the, aspirations I had going in were very, it was a very different field when I was finishing up. The freedom that you had with patients, your ability to direct your own treatment was all now being dictated by insurance companies. And that was part of it. There are other aspects of it. Basically it comes down to you have to love being a therapist. If not, it is just far too taxing. And it's far too difficult. So, I kind of had over a series of incidents, I just had this moment of, I don't love this, and this is what I've been studying for my entire adult life.
Right.
So I had to, I had to make some, quick decisions. I guess we'd call it being agile today. And I was fortunate to have some mentors who did some business consulting on the side, and that's kind of really how I got my foot, my toe into the water of sales and marketing. And then I led my first focus group. And that's when I really fell in love and realized that, my passion for psychology was still there. It was just not wanting to be in that system and always dealing with, illness and that sort of thing. What I was interested in was like, how do everyday people make decisions? How do they direct their lives? What's important to them? And then how does that play out in their behavior? And so went independent for a while, leading focus groups and that sort of thing. And then worked at Accenture for a little while. Not a great fit for me, but I learned a lot. And then made my way into marketing, specifically going to Saatchi & Saatchi.
Awesome. Pretty cool. I'm sure there's a lot of variations that from the outside looking in seem minor or probably major while you were doing it, but pretty cool to pivot into, let's say, using your degree in a different way and then kind of being in that lane for the better part of 25, 30 years. That's really cool that like you kind of picked right.
I
In that
did,
scenario.
yeah. I had, and it's like anybody's career. You look back on it, you realize like all these pivotal moments along the way where people gave you advice or offered you some help or something that just helped me along my path. And one of the reasons I do what I do today on my own is part of it is paying it forward. I'm in the process, very early stages of writing a book. Working title is The Psychologist Playbook, and it's the book that I wish I would have had 30 years ago. It would have been very helpful. And so, look for that probably in early 2027.
That's awesome. I'm super pumped to dive into that. So we'll dive into some of those themes today, hopefully, in this call. All right. So 25 years on the front lines of sales and marketing, 15 years at Saatchi & Saatchi before we went independent. Before we dive into what you've been doing in the past 7 years, what did you learn in that, I'd say, more corporate environment that kind of was the launching pad for what you're doing now?
Yeah, two really big things that come to mind first and foremost. I mean, I think the first thing was not so much what I learned, I guess, was the opportunity to work with really big brands. Some of the biggest, most, admired brands in the world. I've worked with them, whether it's Coca-Cola or Adidas or Walmart or the North Face. I have a very a long list of past clients, and that is, largely due to how much time I spent in, large agency world. It really gives you an opportunity to work with some of the best brands. So that's one. But I think probably the thing that is the most useful to me every day is I learned very quickly I was an academic when I started out and, very into theory and the principles of psychology. I learned very quickly you cannot leave a team with just theory or principles. You have to tell them, what can you actually do with this? You have to make it actionable, usable, something they can start doing at work this week. And that's something that has always stuck with me. And I think, particularly when people hear about my background, in psychology, there's a tendency to instantly think, navel gazing, or this will be interesting but not useful. And so I go out of my way with everything I do to always leave people with, here's why this is important to you. Here's what you can do with it tomorrow.
Yeah, as you mentioned in our pre-call, you have your doctorate in psychology, you go into this type of role, you could border on overly academic, right?
Oh, yeah,
It's
easily.
theory rather than
Yeah.
practice, right?
Especially since
Um,
I'm enamored with it, of course. I
yeah,
wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if I wasn't. And, I learned very quickly, that it is important to provide some degree of background, enough for people to understand the concept, but then you have to shift very quickly. And, I am thankful for, so many of the great sales teams that I have worked with who really, some were rougher than others, but, they did help me get to this point where I really, strive to be actionable.
yeah. So we're going to talk about a lot of those like actionable frontline kind of tactics along the way, but let's steer into one area. How do you maintain the academic side? Where are you kind of pushing the envelope as to where things are moving rather than running a playbook that's operational at that kind of surface level?
Yeah, on Substack. I have a channel, and it's called Influence Without Feeling Gross, and it is all about the intersection of marketing, psychology, and technology. And in particular, I've been doing a lot of writing in the area of AI, and how that impacts not only sellers and how they sell, but also buyers and how they buy. And so that's when I kind of keep myself up with my writing, it enforces the need to be on top of things, do the research, do the reading, understand what's going on.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, well, let's dive into some of the tactics then. So you
Right.
talked about behavior, right? And really, like in that aspect, the motivation to make a decision, make a purchase, right, always traces back to an emotional need. Let's walk us through how you apply that to a B2B sale. Let's say something a little bit more complex. You're managing multiple stakeholders. How does that call to action compared to the emotional need kind of work, and how do you work with teams to develop that?
Yeah. So I think that, yeah, it's kind of a provocative statement, but it's one that I don't make lightly. That everything we buy can be kind of tied back to an emotional need. Um, It is, after 30 years and working across so many different brands and categories, I have yet to find one that, there is not at its core an emotional need. And so, one of the things we talked about in the pre-interview, when I say that, a lot of times I'll get questions about particular categories, like, oh, socks and underwear, stuff like that. And one that comes up quite frequently is toilet paper. And, it's a great example of something that we think of as very mundane and functional and rational. Um, but when we go back to the dark days of COVID, the first few weeks of COVID lockdowns, the number one thing to go off the shelves was toilet paper. You couldn't find it anywhere. The shelves were empty. And, you think about, well, what was going on there? That can't be a rational thing. And, I think it's because, and unfortunately, it's a category I've worked in before. Um, Toilet paper represents some really interesting things to us from an emotional and psychological standpoint. It represents that being prepared, the security of feeling prepared. I have what I need to get things done, if you will. It also represents comfort, cleanliness, things like that. That if you think about those early days of COVID, those were things that were directly under threat. And so I think it became a proxy for feeling more secure with your situation, even when everything was in flux and it's kind of scary at the time. So it's a good example of where even the most mundane things have an emotional underpinning that, often we don't recognize, we don't think about, but when it's under threat, that comes screaming to the surface. And so I think it's really important. And when we start thinking about from a B2B standpoint, the principle stands. Sometimes it looks a little different. And I think, if you were, think about like someone who is an office manager, and they're making buying decisions for the office, obviously there's very much a rational functional side of that, right? And that's how we typically think of it. This is what we need. This is what I'm going to buy. I'm going to assess this based on what, how much we use or what we're using it for. And there is that side of the rational thing. But when you go deeper and you kind of go deeper into the psychology of it, there's also some really important emotional needs. Someone who is in that position of being an office manager, they want to make sure they look competent. Like they want to make sure that people will, take their lead and trust them. That comes down to, personal identity, status, social needs, as far as people relying on how do people see me, and then reducing risk as well. I want to reduce the risk that we're going to have some problem because, I'm not managing the office properly. And so, that gets again into certainty, like the toilet paper example. So, even in, whether it's B2B or B2C, when we are making those purchases, there is a functional side, but there's also a very powerful emotional side that ends up being the actual spark for why we make the decisions we do.
Yeah, and I think on the B2C side, the emotional side of these purchases plays a bigger part when it comes to, I'd say marketing, focus groups, messaging. I think on the B2B side, we lose some of that emotional purview. And I think it's because on the B2C, most purchases beyond the mundane maybe are emotional buying purchases, right? We don't need most of the stuff that we're getting at this point, right? But on the business side, in order to do anything, you have to have some logic behind it, right? You can't make an emotional $100,000 software purchase. So in a sales perspective, I had a sales leader of mine talk about the buyer's journey starts off logical. He had a graph. There's talked about logic and emotional line here. When you're just having interest, the reason to start investigating whether you should work with someone, a service, or buy a piece of software or a product here is a logical one, but you immediately dip down into emotional. And for most of the buyer's journey, it's an emotional decision. And at the very end, it comes up for some logic again to make sure you're making sure you have the right decision.
Mhm.
But most sales leaders don't coach through the emotional journey. Most reps, when they're talking about it, aren't talking about how to take their buyer through the emotional journey that they expect. They still talk about it in a logical sense. These are the gates that I need to pass in order to continue this process. Why do you think that might be? Why do we get stuck in the logical in a B2B sense compared to that
Well,
emotional
I
side of
think
things?
there's a couple of things, and I would say too, when it comes to that emotional journey, and I think that there are, the feelings of an emotional need wax and wane. But I think the emotional need is pretty consistent throughout. Even at the beginning of that journey, if we were to ask somebody, what even made you interested in this category? What even, sparked your first interest in this? And at first, of course, you're going to get the rational stuff like, well, my company needs this. But if you keep asking why, and there's a technique, the 5 whys, if you keep asking why, you'll get deeper and deeper. And it does eventually get to something emotional. So, and I think that's important because when I speak about that emotional need as being motivation, it is the spark, it's the gas pedal for why we buy. Rational thinking, logic, functional need, um, that tends to be the steering wheel that guides where we go with our buying journey, right? But that initial urge, that desire to buy, is very much something that is emotional from the start. And I also want to make a clear distinction because I think this is something that comes up a lot. I say emotional. Um, Unfortunately, that language is a little bit hot. People go to
Yeah.
a place when you say emotional. So I often try to say emotion based instead of
Okay.
emotional because we think emotional has to be flowery or has to show emotion. It doesn't. Emotion-based decision making doesn't necessarily look emotional in any given way. It is simply what is driving that behavior to begin with.
Yeah, it's I don't know if we have the right just language for it in sales, but it's the opposite of mathematical, right? So like even not even logical is probably a loaded term because logical seems like the positive and opposite of logical seems
Right, right.
negative, right?
And that
But
gets
whatever
into
the
a little
opposite
bit
of
of
yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
I was gonna say that gets into a little bit of, there's a little bit of a chicken or egg about why we don't talk about emotion-based buying in B2B as much. Well, one is because we're used to talking about it in logical ROI terms, and so it feels a little foreign to start thinking about, well, what are the emotion-based needs here? And then because we don't talk about it, then it becomes, less obvious. And so there's a little bit of a chicken or egg there. But what I can tell you is it is there. I've worked again, not only B2B, I've worked or B2C. I've worked B2B consistently throughout my career, and the principles are there. They just look different sometimes, but the underlying principles of that emotional need are.
Yeah, it's also because the buying journey is long, right? So let's say you have a 60-day sales cycle, 90-day sales cycle. It's a problem that the business has had for several years. They could have solved it. They haven't yet. It's not a point in time decision-making framework. I need toothpaste, right? So like it's a long decision. And so often, even if you're touching on the below the line, like path that a buyer's taking there, right?
Mhm.
It's a big moving target, right? So like it's not. Well, take this.
Excellent.
Great. As a sales leader, I might ask like, why is this person going to buy? Well, because their business needs a $5 million EBITDA and they're at $3 million. No. Like why? What's the personal stake that your champion has in making a purchase like this, right? It often comes down to they need to hit their targets or they'll get promoted. And that promoted is that is a personal need, not a business
Mhm.
need, right? And that's great.
Sure.
But then like, cool, checkbox that's what it is. And that's the entire journey that my buyer will take is that person needs to get promoted, right? But it's a heavy moving target. And it's hard to consistently assess and it's hard to
Yeah.
consistently plan for. But my guess is in an age where AI is taking some of the process off the plate of a seller, this emotional journey, this instinctual one, is going to play a bigger part. And I think we need to find a really good way to coach reps to, over years of sales experience, get better at managing this part of the process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing, and it makes me think about when I'm working with B2C companies, especially the larger ones that are in categories that often there's not a lot of tangible difference between products in a categories. Think about something like laundry soap, let's say. Um, probably any laundry soap or laundry detergent in that aisle is probably going to get the job done, right? I mean, on a functional level. So then it becomes, well, why would someone choose us then, right? So now that sort of the functional side is fairly at parity, now we have to start thinking about, well, what are other things? So then they start adding in fragrances and whatever that may be. But then everybody's doing that, right? So then it goes deeper. Okay, so now what? And so what you end up with, especially these large companies, and why they invest in the kind of work I do, is because I can take it much more deep. We haven't had a lot of practice with that, and as much practice with that in B2B. And but as we continue down the path where some of this gets automated, or some of these decisions are sort of brought into parity, then the question will be just like in B2C. Okay, well now why would someone choose us? Right? What's the next
Yeah.
layer down that we have to go? And so that's, I think, those that can see that can get ahead of it and start trying to understand, like, what are the needs here, and what at a deeper level, what's happening here, and how can we appeal to that?
Yeah, as you go through this, there's a chance this shift is going to become even more imperative in B2B. So if we stick in software, which I often do, what's happening in software now is the cost of inputs to developing software has decreased greatly. And so the amount of software out there is going to increase and the customizability of that software is going to increase. And actually what you're going to find is software homogenizes and you have a bunch of different options that are relatively similar, right? Before, software was a little bit more like tofu. There's one brand of tofu in the store. I just want to eat tofu because I want to eat less meat. And so I go with tofu. There might be two brands. I still don't know what extra firm or soft means when it comes to tofu. I just pick one and I leave.
Hmm.
Software is going to become more of the cereal aisle, right? So
Yeah.
in that sense, in the space that I'm in as a startup that's trying to disrupt an existing process in sales, I lead with logic. Do you have a win rate problem, right? Like you're not winning enough of your work and I can help you win more work. But oftentimes in this journey over the past year, there's a bigger player in the space that doesn't do what I do as well, but it's a brand name. And a lot of times I talk to folks who are using that software and they're like, listen, it's just easier to tell the board that we use that this
Mhm.
potential platform. So
I
really, if you
mean,
think about it, my discovery, if I was going to get extreme, could entirely be focused on, do you have a need for safety in solving this problem? You just want to tell your board you pick the one that they know, or do you have some desire to be at the forefront of solving this problem, right? Like, and then you would go with me along the way.
mhm.
But I don't lead with that. Most people don't. Like, if you were in a scenario like this where you're talking to a sales team, how would you flesh this out when you're kind of like working
Yeah.
through a process with the sales team? You're sitting around at a table, you have 10 sellers on a cool B2B platform or anything like this. How are you having this discussion to kind of flesh these ideas out?
Yeah, one of the things I like to point out, again, and I said this about the need itself, but I think when we talk about how we message, emotion-based messaging does not need to be emotional. It does not need to look or feel emotional. I'll give you an example from CPG. We did some testing with what were considered rational claims. So these were claims at shelf that a brand would make to try to convince someone, in the last moment of decision, hey, we're good for you. This is why you should buy us. And so we took these claims that were considered rational claims, and we did some work with consumers and which of these would you consider most effective, and then why, and continued asking why until we got to somewhere that felt like it was deep. And so one of them, for example, was um, kids brush 30% longer. That's it. Brand, the logo, kids brush 30% longer. And that was a very successful, rational claim made by a big brand. And what we found was that what this actually tuned into was the parents' needs for um, caring, like, right, feeling like a good parent, feeling like, one, identity. I'm doing the best for my child. I'm buying something that will actually get them to brush longer, and they'll be healthier as a result. Also had to do with caretaking, just that sense of identity and care that was so strong. But in one little statement that even contained a number, it was really pulling on some emotional needs that were there in a very succinct, very efficient type of way. And I think that's how to think about emotion-based messaging. It isn't necessarily emotional. Now, it can be, depending on the context, that may or may not be appropriate. But it doesn't have to be. It just has to be based in an understanding of the emotional need and then speaking to that emotional need.
Yeah, this is I read anytime I have to do some product positioning, which is not my forte. I read a book by April Dunford. It's obviously awesome, which is just an excellent positioning book. But even still, when I do it, I still position in the logical, right? And I think we need new phraseology for this. Whenever you publish your book,
Yeah,
emotional, rational, logical, instinctual. These are not the right terms,
yeah.
right? I think the
Unfortunately,
identity works. Good, yeah. Yeah.
like so many things that have to do with emotion, we developed our language for emotion before we understood emotion.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And our understanding of emotion now has really increased so much, even over the last 20 25 years, but our language hasn't really caught up, and I think that's part of the challenge. We run into it all the time. It's why I try to bring examples and define things as best I can. But yeah, I mean, even now, there is no one official definition of emotion.
Yeah. I guess Eastern cultures who have been doing this for a lot longer than us probably have better language for this. But sticking with it, I think in this scenario, if I was actually positioning a product now, right? Like, and I want my buyers to be the ones that don't pick the safe choice. They want to be at the cutting edge of this problem. All my positioning should be around that. I should have my version of kids brush 30% longer.
Yeah.
There's not a feature, there's not a color, you don't know if it's electric or non-electric, doesn't matter. Kids brush 30% longer. Sales teams are selling like it's 3 years from now rather than 30 years ago, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
and the only people that'll buy that are the ones that are predisposed to wanting to be at that level. It's the pre-chasm of the crossing the
Yeah.
chasm that I should
And
be
that's why
targeting
it's
here.
so important to, understand your target, right? That's pretty, marketing 101, sales and marketing 101. But there's a reason for that. And it is because the better you understand them, the more, the more precise your language can be with them, and the more it's almost like speaking in code to them, right? You understand them so well that you know how to talk to them in a way that they will understand and feel like is relevant to them.
Agreed. Okay, cool. Let's get back into the actionable
Yeah.
there. It may have gotten slightly academic, but I like to think that we were still rooted in real life use cases there. Let's talk about, you talk about sellers building resilient relationships with their buyers. You
Mhm.
have a 5Fs framework there. Can you break
Yeah.
this down for us? Give us an example, and tell us what like a company might get right versus what they get wrong with this type of framework.
Yeah. This is really part of the core of my philosophy is that, you know, manipulation and tricks may win you one sale, but they're going to end up chasing people away in the end. Think of your own experience. We've all been in a situation where we felt, sort of coerced into buying something or tricked into buying something that didn't hold up. The first reactions are to be frustrated, to be resentful. And we call it, there's a term that in psychology, we call it psychological reactance, which basically means when we feel like our ability to control our own lives is threatened, we will do just about anything. We'll take drastic measures to regain our sense of personal command. And that will include, avoiding whatever that situation was. And if you're a brand that's been manipulating your target and they, turn on you, you're in a very bad position. So I talk about building resilient relationships with your customers because what that does is it creates buyers who will come back again and again. They will buy more from you. They'll spend more per trip. They will um, tell others about, well, how great it was to buy from you or how great your product is. And that is far more economical than having to go and attain new customers. That is very expensive. So the 5 Fs is something that I created and kind of honed over many years of what does that look like when you have a really positive, resilient relationship with your customers that is going to help you build sustainable growth over time. Um, so there, and just quickly, I'll go through them very quickly. But familiar. So basically, and these are both two-way, by the way. It's buyer towards seller and seller towards buyer. Familiar, like it is intimate. You understand each other. They see that you understand them. They feel like they understand you as a brand and what you stand for, what you provide. Very important. Favorable. Obviously, we want favorable relationships, right? So we want them to see us favorably, but we also want them to know that we see them favorably. That the human acknowledgement is so important. And so I feel like a brand gets me, they appreciate my life, they understand what I'm doing and trying to accomplish. Felt deeply, so this is getting below or beneath that just logical transactional type of relationship where there is emotion involved and you're able to identify it and deliver on it. Faithful. This is clear. This is where we get into loyalty. I don't love that word, but we don't have a really good other one for it. But faithful is consistent. They see you as consistent. They are consistently buying from you. And then finally, forgiving. And this is really, I think, one of the most important aspects of this relationship is forgiving. We all screw up. Brands screw up all the time. If you have a resilient relationship, though, your customer is going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're going to immediately think, well, they're either going to make it right, they'll get it right next time. Somehow this will resolve, and I don't have to go running to a competitor. So it really does protect you from competitive forces that can be a problem. And I think that when you kind of see your relationship with customers similar to you see a relationship, any other relationship in your life, because these apply across the board to any kind of relationship you have, that you can start to kind of hone each of these areas. And I actually have an assessment that I use, and your listeners are going to get an online link to it for the first time because I haven't put it online yet. And so I'm going to send that over to you so they can try it out. I will ask you for a little grace here because it is the first time it's going out. So hopefully there's no bugs. But it is, I think it is so important for buyers to just be thinking about what is the status of my relationship with my customers? Where do I stand with them? Where do they stand with me? And kind of when you go through each of these 5 things, it just gives you a way of kind of assessing where you're at with each of those and be able to fine tune those.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, maybe let's say my second to last question, a topic I want to make sure we hit. So let's get down to the core of the difference between, let's say, how psychology stays relatively steady, but behavior shifts, right? You talk about human beings have honing in their base psychology for 300,000 years as a species at this point, right? Like it doesn't move that fast at this point. But behavior shifts. Behavior shifts where it's still rooted in psychology, but behaviors are different. And you talk about how this is a shift of environment and new options. Can you give us some examples of like core psychology that, like, it seems like when we were selling microwave ovens for the first time in the 60s to complex AI-based software now, it's still the same needs, the same itch you're scratching at the psychological level, and how sellers should be thinking about.
Yeah, I think one way to really think about this. So I gave you the example of, for me, music. I buy a lot of music. When I was, in high school, I used to spend tons of time in the record store, just, searching through records, finding new artists, all that kind of stuff. And I loved it. Don't get to do it as often as I'd like now, but I'm on Spotify all the time, right? Now, if you think about what were the needs that, emotion-based needs when I was shopping record stores, well, it was discovery, like this sort of search and discovery, if you will, just the joy in that. There's identity, the kind of music you listen to says something about yourself, or finding that new edgy band means you're cool, whatever. And if I look today, like, why do I spend time on Spotify? Similar type things, search and discovery, identity, those types of things are the psychology. The underlying emotional need is the same. The behavior is entirely different. And that's because Spotify found a way to eliminate much of the friction of buying music when you had to go to a store and all those things, made it achieving those emotional needs simpler, faster, easier. If you're a salesperson and you think about it this way, be looking at other maybe adjacent categories or something in your arena where there is some kind of friction that gets in the way, and be thinking about how can we remove that friction, and help them still maintain. That is the key. You can't just rip out friction and then rip out the emotional, meeting the emotional need with it. It has to be, how does simplifying this help people achieve the same need in a way that is simpler, faster, or easier?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So, like, if you think about it, I'll bring it into tech again because where I know, right? Your early stage, the only people that are going to buy are people that want to be at the forefront of how to do things different, right? So let's say that's the case. Then you go into a sale. Early stage companies, especially in tech, often don't have SOC 2 compliance or aren't ISO 27001 compliant, right? Because it's expensive to be that. You're constantly evolving your software anyway, so it's not the right time. But if you think about it, that's a major friction that you can try to eliminate. It's almost like more important that a non-brand name has the ability to give their people who want to be at the cutting edge quick and easy, frictionless ways to prove to their company that they're not making a foolish decision. Something that's going to get them into trouble, right? So you almost need to combine those two. It's like, great, what's the, again, psychological need that someone who's buying my software is scratching? If it's safety, you may actually not really need that SOC 2 compliance because everyone knows this brand. So, like, even if they're not SOC 2 compliant, everyone has Salesforce. I didn't even ask if they were SOC 2 compliant, right? But then, like, how do you combine those factors to make sure that what you're offering just helps to eliminate the friction. But again, all comes back down to someone looking for safety or someone looking for aggression here in this space, right?
Yeah,
And solving the
absolutely.
problem in like a future forward way.
Yeah, and that's where we start to get into strategy. That's where you get into ideation sessions and kind of putting heads together and that sort of thing to come up with those ideas. But now at least you've got some strategic direction, right? Because you know what they want and you know what they're struggling with. I want to be edgier. I want to be seen as, front, cutting edge, but it's too risky for me to do that right now. Well, if someone can find a way to help them achieve that desire,
Right.
and reduce the risk at the same time, now you've got gold. Right. I mean,
Right.
that's how this all works. I mean, and there's zillions of, examples and, from CPG where that's happened and, they've been able to meet a need better, Spotify, meet a need better, same need, different approach that's easier, faster, and as well enjoyable. It is enjoyable to spend time.
Right.
It doesn't replace for me the store. I get there when I can, but I don't get there as often as I'd like. Even when you were talking earlier about all the software becoming very similar, right? But there's still an advantage to somehow finding differentiation because you want your product to come to mind for people, right? And that only happens through differentiation. You have to like claim space in your customer's head. And the way you do that is generally through relevance, understanding your customer as well as you can, and then connecting your product to something that is relevant and meaningful to them. We call that valence in psychology. And it's simply how available is a certain product, item, person, whatever it is in a person's mind. Does it have valence, positive or negative? Positive valence means I feel good about it. Negative valence means I think about it and I hate it. Positive valence is differentiation. That is branding right there. That is what brands try to achieve. And so I think, especially when you're in a category that is on the road to becoming commoditized, that's when you really need to find those emotional connections. And, CPG is rife with examples. Believe it or not, there was a day when coffee was commoditized. It was, 30 years ago, but coffee was coffee. Nobody cared. You went to a diner and you paid like a couple bucks at and not even that. You paid like $1 for a cup of coffee. And you could sit there all day and drink it, right? And then along came Starbucks, and, people can argue Starbucks tastes better or whatever, but there were other premium brands out there. It wasn't like there weren't premium brands. It just Starbucks hit on something, and that was much more in the emotional realm. And here we are. Even a brand like Method from a few years ago, cleaning supplies. Who cares? Now Method realized, oh, well, people don't put their cleaning supplies on the counter because they're ugly. Let's make them look nicer. Bam! You got a huge, multi-million-dollar brand bought out by a bigger brand. But, I think, there are zillions of examples, like from a few years ago, Dollar Shave Club, razors, who cares? All they keep doing is adding more blades, right? It was like 2, and then it was 3, and then it was 4. I think they're up to 6 or 7 at some point. And like people got bored with that. And then along comes this little startup, Dollar Shave Club, with attitude, right? And people wanted to be part of it. That's not rational. That's emotion, right? And that, I think anyone who thinks that cannot apply to B2B is, one, fooling themselves, and 2, putting themselves at a huge disadvantage, because I think it's an area that is ripe for it. Someone's going to figure out, how can we differentiate in a different way that's going to resonate with our B2B customers and, motivate them to buy from us over competition. And that, that's going to be very big.
Completely agree. All right, cool. Last question. We've had a couple of large business shifts. I actually classify them as 3 shifts. One that is a little less prevalent than the other. So one, we put computers on every desk 30 years ago. And I think that's the right parallel to LLMs. We went from notes, pad and pen, to computerized pad and pen. And now LLMs actually do work without us asking. So that's a new evolution. And in between, the other one is the whole work from home meetings over your PC seems like it's regular now. We've quadrupled the number of meetings we have, and a lot of people are taking them from home, where 10 years ago that wasn't a thing, right? So 3 major shifts, let's say, in business, and 2 really in the consumer supply chain there. Tell me, with LLMs, how do you think that's going to shift? Not psychology, maybe a little bit, unfortunately, but like behavior in a way over the next couple of years in a way that maybe most people aren't thinking about.
Yeah. Well, I think that I have a lot of different things to say about this. I think that, when it comes to that, one big theme that I have repeatedly is that, access to information used to be an edge. It used to be your edge. Like when I was coming up in school and business, the better, the more facile you were with finding and information, having access to information, knowing information was an advantage, huge advantage. I don't think that's going to be as much the case anymore when the information is out there for anyone. It's really, has democratized information in a way. The problem is, it puts out information that is polished, that sounds confident, but is often wrong. And that's where we get into trouble. And so I think that the advantage, probably starting now, but it's only going to get more and more of an advantage, is discernment. It is critical thinking. It is, can I take the outputs of, whatever AI system I'm using and evaluate those? Does this sound right? Do I know how to evaluate it in this particular category of information? So for me, obviously anything's like psychology based, pretty, after all this time, I'm pretty good at being to suss that out, right? But I think what we're seeing more and more is we're using it as a substitute for critical thinking. And that is where we can get into a lot of problems, some of them legal. We've even seen, companies get sued for, their AI chatbots giving people wrong information and, claiming, well, it wasn't us, it was the AI. But the judge came back and said, no, the AI was representing you. You are responsible for that poor judgment, even though it was AI. And so I think that the ability to discern between good and bad information, the ability to find, the flaws in the arguments, those things, because AI isn't going to tell you. They never come back with an answer like, well, maybe it's this, I'm not sure. It's always, no, the answer is this and this and this, and here you go. And if you just kind of cut and paste that, you are running a huge risk of making some very big screw ups that could affect you and your company in very negative ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, mass producing information in a way.
Mhm.
Information's always been wrong when it's human generated as well, right? Like you have to
Yeah, I
take things
mean,
on spec, and discernment was important, but now the level of information that's available is going to only greatly increase, right? So it's much more to discern, right? So like
yeah, I
to
mean,
the
in
point
the
where we may discredit anything generated altogether because like it's just
yeah,
too
I
much
mean,
information to figure out.
yeah, and I think that's where you want to have someone in the room who is a critical thinker, who's going to ask the dumb question. I always say, like, I've made a great career out of, asking dumb questions. That's what I do for a living, essentially. And, I think that the ability and the willingness to put yourself out there and say, wait, I'm not sure if that sounds right. I've been at that table many times, and I know how hard that is to do sometimes. Because, we always assume everyone else has got it figured out. Here's the secret. I can tell you, he's like, gather around, youngsters. Here's the secret for you.
Yep.
Nobody has it figured out. Like, we're all trying to figure things out. Like, obviously we have our own experiences and expertise and stuff, but I think in general, like, we're all trying to keep up with technology. We're all trying to keep up with information, all of those things. And so if you have a question, ask it. It's, probably 5 other people in the room have the same question. And even if they don't, I think the people that ask questions, productive, I'm assuming these are productive, constructive questions. are going to be more and more valuable because they're going to be the ones that save you from a multi-million-dollar lawsuit or marketing mess up or mistargeting your target, whatever it is, and it's going to be the critical thinkers, the ones that, that have honed that. That's not something that you're born with per se. It is something that you do have to build out.
Awesome. Well, that's a great take. Well, listen, you're writing a book and coming out next year. You have a Substack. Tell us what that name of that Substack again, and where can people find you otherwise?
Yeah, the Substack is called Influence Without Feeling Gross. That's the tagline of my company is Influence Customer Behavior Without Feeling Gross. And my website is thebichologist.com. There you can learn about me. You can see what I'm up to, what I'm doing, and it has links to everything as well. I always love hearing from people.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. You have a really unique perspective in the space, and I look forward to read that book next year.
Yeah, my pleasure, Warren. Thank you.